Jar Jar Binks was a Sith Lord, and Dooku may have secretly trained Anakin. Decades of films, series, novels, and comics have left gaps in the galaxy's historical record that fans continue to pick apart. Drawing from canon sources, with one exception from the Legends record, what fills these gaps is more coherent than Lucasfilm has ever officially acknowledged, starting with the wildest and building towards the ones that are almost impossible to argue against. Not every entry will sit comfortably. In the film Attack of the Clones, Jar Jar Binks was sitting in closed Senate sessions with no formal title, no political background, and no clear reason for existing anywhere near a seat of power. Before that, he was a Gungan outcast who had been banished from Oto Gunga when Qui-Gon found him wandering through a swamp on Naboo. Somehow, nobody asked how he got into the inner circle of Republic politics. When the Senate was debating whether to grant Chancellor Palpatine emergency authority over the Republic's military, a vote that would dissolve the last institutional checks on his office, Jar Jar stood up and introduced the motion, and one exiled amphibian with no credentials walked into the chamber and handed a Sith Lord an army. For a lot of fans, that sequence never sat right. Jar Jar's battlefield record on Naboo is harder to explain away. The clumsiness followed a pattern that grew harder to dismiss the more closely anyone looked at it. Every stumble landed exactly where it needed to. Every accidental discharge found the right target, and every chain reaction veered in the Republic's favor. Across an entire battle, that kind of accidental but consistent success becomes statistically absurd. What this all points to is a performance. Palpatine had a quiet partner embedded in plain sight for years, hidden behind the one identity nobody in the galaxy would ever take seriously enough to investigate. Jar Jar's story ends with a vote nobody questioned and a war that followed shortly after. Somewhere else in the galaxy, a child was building something in a Tatooine junkyard that would end up present at every major event in the saga. C-3PO was a protocol droid without any military function, but he somehow ended up present during the Naboo crisis, the Clone Wars, the Rebel Alliance's most sensitive planning sessions, the assault on the Death Star, and the Battle of Endor. The droid's access to classified information across 6 decades of galactic conflict was never questioned, restricted, or explained. The official position is that Anakin Skywalker, at 9 years old, built C-3PO from scavenged mechanical parts on Tatooine, but no further explanation was ever offered. The question that has never been answered is whether a 9-year-old working from spare parts could have arrived at those specifications alone. Someone guided that design, possibly through the Force or through instruction that left no record, and the droid was built with capabilities that went beyond translation. His memory wipe at the end of Revenge of the Sith removed his recollection of events, but left his hardware intact, which means whatever he was built to do continued functioning whether he remembered it or not. Nobody in the saga ever asked why a protocol droid kept ending up at the center of everything. Certainly C-3PO was counting on this inattention for 19 years. Obi-Wan Kenobi spent 19 years on Tatooine watching over Luke from a distance. He knew R2-D2 and C-3PO from the Clone Wars, had fought alongside them across multiple campaigns, and would have recognized both droids the moment they showed up in the desert. The idea that he played stranger when he met them again alongside Luke is one of the most quietly compelling in the entire saga. His introduction scene in A New Hope does nothing to contradict it. He greets Luke warmly, deflects questions about his past, and gives R2 exactly the kind of careful attention you'd give a familiar asset rather than a stranger's hardware. When R2 plays Leia's message, Obi-Wan listens and moves without a flicker of purpose, his response calibrated rather than reactive. The reason for the performance is straightforward. Luke was 19, had no training, and had spent his entire life on a moisture farm with no knowledge of his father's identity or his own connection to the Force. Obi-Wan was managing an introduction that had to go a specific way. Acknowledging a prior relationship with the droids would have opened questions he wasn't prepared to answer yet, including why he'd been on Tatooine for 2 decades and what he actually knew about Luke's family. C-3PO's memory wipe at the end of Revenge of the Sith was confirmed on screen. R2's was not, which means R2 remembered everything and said nothing. Two old colleagues playing strangers for the same reason in the same room. The droids kept the secret because nobody asked them to break it. One of the Republic's allies may have foresight clear enough to decide that dying was the most useful thing he could do. Qui-Gon Jinn chose to lose that duel on Naboo. He was the more experienced fighter, he had faced worse opponents, and he understood the Force at a depth nobody else in the Order had reached. The case for it has been circulating quietly since the Phantom Menace, and it is harder to dismiss than it first appears. His death produced something argument alone never could. While he was alive, the Jedi Council had refused to train Anakin, dismissed his warnings about the Sith returning, and repeatedly overruled his judgment on the most important question he had ever brought before them. He had no institutional leverage, no allies on the Council willing to break ranks, and no path to getting Anakin trained through argument alone. His death changed every single one of those conditions in a single afternoon. Dying on Maul's blade gave Obi-Wan his trials by necessity, which removed the Council's ability to block Anakin's training on the grounds that Obi-Wan wasn't ready. It transformed Anakin from a controversial candidate into a dying Jedi Master's final request, which is a very different kind of argument to refuse. His presence had made the whole situation a power struggle. His absence made it a matter of honor. He wasn't sacrificing himself, he was repositioning. He had already discovered the path to consciousness after death, which meant the transition carried none of the finality it would have for anyone else. He knew he could continue guiding events from the other side, and in every measurable way, he did. What Qui-Gon set in motion shaped everything that followed, but the prophecy that the Jedi Order built its entire future around may have been written by the enemy it never identified. The Chosen One prophecy appears in the Jedi archives as an ancient text predicting the arrival of a being who would bring balance to the Force. The Jedi built centuries of theological expectation around it, and when Qui-Gon found a 9-year-old slave on Tatooine with the highest midichlorian count ever recorded, the Order accepted him as the prophecy's subject without seriously questioning where the prophecy came from. Obi-Wan admitted in Return of the Jedi that the prophecy may have been misread. He never considered the possibility that it was authored by the people who benefited most from the Jedi believing it. The Jedi archives were not impenetrable. In Attack of the Clones, Obi-Wan discovers that the planet Kamino has been erased from the records, and the librarian confirms that if something isn't in the archives, it simply doesn't exist. A system that blind to its own gaps was equally blind to additions. A document planted centuries earlier by Sith agents would have aged into the collection and become indistinguishable from legitimate ancient texts long before anyone thought to verify it. Palpatine's entire strategy depended on the Jedi lowering their guard around the most powerful Force user they ever encountered, a prophecy that told the Order to expect, protect, and train exactly that person was the most efficient way to guarantee they would. The Jedi didn't just fail to stop Anakin's fall, the prophecy actively recruited them into enabling it. The archives held other vulnerabilities that influenced the war before it started. One Jedi understood the value of letting himself be captured on purpose. Obi-Wan Kenobi was captured on Geonosis after tracking Jango Fett from Kamino. He had enough information at that point to escape, transmit his report, and avoid capture. He chose not to. His capture was more useful to the Republic than his escape would have been, and a man of his experience understood that calculation before he walked into the arena. His distress signal from Geonosis triggered the largest Jedi deployment in living memory. It forced the Senate's hand on the clone army vote in a matter of hours. It gave the Republic a military, a war, and a legal framework for emergency powers all in the same afternoon. Obi-Wan had already identified the droid foundries, the Separatist leadership, and the scope of the coming conflict. He understood what his capture would set in motion, and he walked into it on purpose. Obi-Wan was trained by Qui-Gon and inherited that philosophy of acting in the present, doing what the moment required, regardless of personal cost. If he calculated that allowing himself to be captured was the only move that would force the Senate to act before the Separatists were ready, he would have made that calculation without hesitation. The Clone Wars followed, a decade of conflict that served Palpatine's agenda almost perfectly. Obi-Wan's sacrifice may have been genuine and still have been precisely what Palpatine needed. Obi-Wan spent his life making moves whose full consequences he couldn't see. The man on the other side of those same battles perfectly understood every consequence and used them accordingly. Obi-Wan Kenobi was Anakin's official master, but Dooku was the one who actually shaped him. Their encounters during the Clone Wars were presented as straightforward enemy exchanges, and Dooku's behavior had nothing in common with someone trying to win. Across their engagements in the Clone Wars and into Revenge of the Sith, Dooku consistently pushed Anakin toward rage without pressing for a killing blow. He provoked, tested, and withdrew. He challenged Anakin's relationship with the Jedi Council, questioned the Order's honesty, and presented the Republic's corruption in ways designed to plant specific doubts. Someone trying to eliminate a threat closes the fight, and someone preparing a successor keeps it open and keeps pushing. Among the Sith, the rule of two created a specific kind of loyalty. The Master knew the apprentice would eventually make a move. The apprentice knew the Master's death was part of the design. Dooku's position in that hierarchy was already decided the moment Palpatine identified Anakin. His treatment of Anakin reflected a man who had already accepted that his job was to prepare Anakin and step aside when the time came, and every exchange between them served that acceptance rather than contradicting it. His final scene in Revenge of the Sith confirms it. He looked at Anakin standing over him with two blades at his throat and didn't appear surprised. He appeared finished, in the way someone looks when the last task has been completed. Dooku spent years steering Anakin towards a destination Palpatine had been building towards. On Mustafar, the Force spent two people to keep one instrument in play, and the debt it ran up doing so is the saga's final unresolved question. Yoda lived for 900 years. He sat at the center of the Jedi Order for centuries, trained generations of knights and masters, and had access to Force abilities that very few in the Order's history could match. The uncomfortable case, the one that gained ground since the Clone Wars deepened his arc, is that he saw what was coming and chose not to stop it. By the time of the prequel trilogy, the Jedi Order had drifted badly from its own foundations. It had become a political institution embedded in the Republic's power structure, running military campaigns, holding advisory seats, and making strategic decisions that had nothing to do with balance or the Force. Yoda acknowledged this directly in Revenge of the Sith, telling Obi-Wan that the Order he knew was gone. He didn't say that after the fall, he said it while standing in the wreckage, as if he had been watching it happen for a long time. His choices after Order 66 are harder to square with pure defeat. He went into exile on Dagobah rather than mounting a resistance, spent 2 decades in isolation, and then helped shape the training of a new generation from outside the old institutional framework. Defeat doesn't look like that. Clearing the ground to build something better does. Luke trained in a swamp with no institution behind him, and that was never an accident. 2 of the Order's most senior members may have known exactly why that institution needed to go, and one of them knew far earlier than he ever admitted. Where the previous theory argues that Yoda allowed the Order to fall as an institution, this goes further and more specific. Yoda and Mace Windu didn't just watch an institution decay. At least one of them identified the man accelerating that decay years before Anakin walked into Palpatine's office with confirmation, and the decision not to act was calculated rather than a failure of perception. Windu's behavior across the Clone Wars told a story before Anakin ever walked into that office. His distrust of Palpatine was visible and consistent. His insistence on placing a Jedi on the Chancellor's personal security detail, his resistance to Palpatine's emergency powers expansions, and his immediate move to arrest rather than negotiate when Anakin revealed the truth all pointed to a man who had already made up his mind long before the confirmation arrived. Yoda's post-Order 66 admission that the Jedi had lost their ability to use the Force through arrogance and attachment pointed to an institutional failure he had been watching accumulate for years. Windu and Yoda moving against the Supreme Chancellor without proof would have destroyed everything the Order had built inside the Senate and handed Palpatine exactly the crisis he needed to accelerate his timeline. Waiting for confirmation while keeping Palpatine under quiet Jedi surveillance was the more defensible strategic choice. Waiting for the right moment to act against Palpatine produced an opening that never came. Elsewhere, a commander was making a very different kind of calculated decision, one that looked like failure and may have been the most important move in the entire war. The Millennium Falcon left the Death Star with no real resistance. For a station that had just demonstrated its capacity by destroying an entire planet, the pursuit was remarkably light, and the ship carrying the stolen Death Star plans flew away intact. Vader letting it happen has been part of fan debate since A New Hope, and it holds up better than the alternative of simple oversight from the Empire's top commander. The tracking device is the key piece of evidence. A ship that gets destroyed or immediately boarded can't lead anyone anywhere. For the tracker to work, the Falcon had to leave, stay intact, and reach its destination. Vader understood that. His presence during the departure gave him direct authority over how aggressively the pursuit was run, and he ran it loosely on purpose. His behavior earlier in the film points to the same calculation. He let Obi-Wan go rather than finishing the duel, which is difficult to explain given Vader's ability in combat. Two calculated decisions in the same film, both prioritizing what came next over what was right in front of him, pointed to a commander who understood the battle was never just about the Death Star. What the tracking plan ultimately produced was the rebel base location, a full assault, and the near destruction of the rebellion in a single engagement, a plan that succeeded up until an X-Wing pilot with no targeting computer dropped 2 proton torpedoes into a 2-meter exhaust port. One lucky shot was all that stood between Vader's gamble and a complete Imperial victory. At another point in time, a Jedi Master's tragic end may require some much-needed confirmation. In a saga where Darth Maul survived being cut in half and falling down a reactor shaft, and Luke walked away from a Bespin antenna after a freefall, it wasn't a reach to conclude that one of the Jedi Order's most physically capable masters could survive a fall from Coruscant's upper levels. Mace Windu took a sustained burst of Force lightning, lost his sword hand, and went through the Chancellor's window. The films never showed him land. That absence has been pulling at fans ever since Revenge of the Sith came out. Coruscant's cityscape stacks hundreds of levels of infrastructure, traffic lanes, and platforms in every direction. A fall from that height wouldn't have been a clean drop to the ground. It would have intersected with ledges, airspeeder lanes, and platform edges along the way, any of which could have broken the descent. His consciousness and physical conditioning on the way down are the two variables that determine whether he lived or didn't, and given his mastery of Vapad, the case that he had options during that fall isn't hard to make. Vapad, the 7th and most aggressive form of lightsaber combat, and one Windu himself developed, was built around channeling incoming aggression and redirecting it, translating physically into an extraordinary grasp of force and movement in real time. So dangerous was the form that only Windu ever fully mastered it, precisely because it required brushing the edge of the dark side without crossing into it. A Jedi who trained specifically to work with momentum coming at him would have had more options during that fall than most. Windu's fate has never been officially closed. Luke Skywalker had been training with Yoda on Dagobah for weeks when he left for Bespin. He was not ready. Yoda told him directly, and the duel with Vader confirmed it within the first exchange. Luke lost his hand, lost his lightsaber, and nearly lost his life hanging from an antenna above a gas giant. The conventional reading is that he was outmatched, but losing was the point. Luke's behavior in Return of the Jedi is the evidence. He surrendered to Imperial forces on Endor voluntarily, walked into Vader's presence unarmed, and stood before the Emperor without attempting to fight his way out. His entire strategy in the final film was built around personal connection rather than combat, around the belief that Vader could be reached, and that reaching him was worth more than defeating him. That strategy didn't emerge fully formed on Endor. It was built from the wreckage of Bespin. Losing on that antenna gave Luke something a victory wouldn't have. It gave him confirmation that Vader was his father, delivered in a moment of total vulnerability that made the revelation impossible to dismiss. It gave him a reason to believe that something of Anakin Skywalker still existed inside the armor, because a man who had truly become nothing but Vader would have let his son fall. Vader didn't. He offered his hand. Luke climbed back up that antenna shaft, having gotten exactly what he came for, and everything that followed in Return of the Jedi was built on that moment. The man he was trying to reach had been fully present inside that armor for 23 years, and what that presence chose to do with itself is the saga's most contested question. The assumption that Anakin Skywalker was somehow diminished, suppressed, or buried inside Darth Vader is one the films never make. It is one the audience made for them because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with for long. Anakin was present and aware inside that suit from the moment Palpatine sealed it shut on Coruscant until the moment he took it off on the second Death Star. Every order, every atrocity, every planet, Anakin Skywalker, fully conscious, making choices. The most detailed account of Vader's psychology in any source, canon or legends, comes from Matthew Stover's novelization of Revenge of the Sith, a Legends text that has never been contradicted by canon and remains the most granular portrait of that transition available. Stover describes Vader's first moments in the suit not as a suppression of Anakin's consciousness, but as an amplification of his grief and rage, a feedback loop engineered by Palpatine to keep him angry, isolated, and dependent. The suit removed every buffer between Anakin's darkest impulses and his actions. What emerged wasn't a different person, it was Anakin without restraint, sustained by a machine, and pointed at a galaxy. Films support this more than they contradict it. Vader's interactions with Luke carry a weight that makes no sense if Anakin wasn't present. His line in Return of the Jedi, that it is too late for him, is not the statement of a man who has forgotten who he was. It is the statement of a man who remembers everything and has concluded he has gone too far to come back. That is a different and far darker admission than amnesia. His redemption in Return of the Jedi stops being a return from darkness under this reading. It becomes a man who chose darkness knowingly for 23 years, finally choosing differently. The Force didn't restore Anakin Skywalker in that reactor shaft. Anakin Skywalker restored himself, which means everything Vader did before that moment was a choice he owned. Palpatine's line in Revenge of the Sith about Darth Plagueis carries more weight than the scene lets on. He tells Anakin that Plagueis learned to manipulate midichlorians to create life, and that the knowledge died with him when Palpatine killed him in his sleep. That line gets presented as a bedtime story about someone else's power. What has circulated since 2005 holds that Palpatine kept the technique and used it long before that conversation ever took place. Anakin Skywalker had no father. Shmi confirmed that plainly and without apparent deception. He was also born with the highest midichlorian count ever recorded, higher than Yoda, higher than any Jedi the Order had encountered in its history. The Jedi called it destiny. Palpatine may have had a more accurate word for it. If Palpatine used Plagueis' research to create Anakin, the Chosen One prophecy didn't catch him off guard, he authored it. The Jedi spent decades training and protecting a weapon Palpatine planted inside their order from conception, pouring resources into a child whose connection to the Force was always going to be turned against them. Palpatine spent those same decades pulling on Anakin's fear of loss, his distrust of the Council, and his hunger for power the Order refused to acknowledge. Anakin's fall was a delivery. The man who pretended to be his closest friend had been building toward that moment since before Anakin drew his first breath. The final question the saga left open has nothing to do with Palpatine. It sits in a medical bay on Polis Massa, where two people were dying at the same moment, and only one of them was supposed to. Padme died on a medical table in a facility equipped to handle almost any physical trauma, with no injury the doctors could identify or treat. The cause recorded was that she lost the will to live, which is the kind of answer written down when the instruments show nothing and the patient is already gone. Medically, her death made no sense. Anakin was on Mustafar at the same time, his lungs destroyed, his body burned beyond recovery, still alive when Palpatine pulled him from the lava field. The suit kept him breathing, but the suit doesn't account for the timing. Two people the Force had locked together through one of the strongest bonds in the saga's history, one fading and one holding on, in the same window of time. The Force drew from Padme to keep Anakin alive because his part in the saga wasn't done. He still had a son to face and an Emperor to drag into a reactor shaft decades later. The Force had already rewritten the rules around Anakin once before, producing a child with no father through midichlorian manipulation. Drawing from Padme to keep him breathing was consistent with a pattern of bending what should have been impossible to keep him alive long enough to finish what he started. Her life was drawn out of her to keep a man alive who would spend the next 2 decades serving the Emperor who ordered her death. The cruelest part of Anakin's entire arc is that the Force spent decades keeping him alive long enough to fulfill a purpose, and the first life it spent to keep him going was the one person he turned to the dark side to protect. For those drawn to the absolute limits of what these individuals were capable of, a breakdown of the 7 levels of power ranks the most formidable beings in the history of the saga. For those more interested in the consequences of everything covered here, a separate ranking examines the most brutal deaths recorded across the various eras of the Republic and the Empire.